Running headfirst into an enemy force is rarely a good idea, especially when they're armed with guns and can see you coming. In the Second World War, Japanese bayonet charges were common enough that they would come to define these fanatical soldiers. But not all infantry charges were suicidal, and not all of them were conducted by the forces of Imperial Japan. Every so often, the soldiers of other nations fixed bayonets and let adrenaline puppeteer them to death and glory. In this video, we tell the tales of 5 infantry charges from the Second World War. Following the D-Day landings on the 6th of June 1944, the 101st Airborne Division found themselves scattered throughout Normandy and in dire need of consolidation. By the 9th, the 501st, 502nd and 506th Parachute Infantry Regiments, or PRIs, were more or less ready to roll, so Lieutenant General Omar Bradley tasked them with capturing the Axis-held town of Khartoum. This was part of the grander Allied strategy of building a stronger defensive line in anticipation of German counterattacks following the American landings at Utah and Omaha. To add to the drama, the Germans had inundated the floodplains between the American troops and Khartoum and blown up one of the 4 highway bridges spanning over the Doubs River and its tributaries as they had withdrawn into the town. To reach their objective, the Americans would have to repair and then cross the bridge. Once they did that, they could cross the 3rd and 4th bridges and take the fight to the defending German force, namely the 2nd Fallschirmjäger Division and 2 Ostlegionen battalions, the latter composed of Soviet volunteers. Early morning on the 10th of June, the 3rd Battalion of the 502nd PIR approached Bridge 2 and found that the friendly engineers who were trying to repair it were having a difficult time, probably because a German 88mm gun was dumping shells on their heads. In command of the 3rd Battalion was Lieutenant Colonel Robert Cole. Cole didn't want to wait around for repairs. He wanted to see what was going on up ahead, so he sent a patrol over the river in a small boat. When they came back at around 5:30 AM, they had bad news. While Bridge 3 was crossable, the Germans had installed an obstacle known as a Belgian gate on Bridge 4. The patrol had squeezed through the obstacle, only to meet flares and mortar and machine gun fire, most of it coming from a farmhouse ahead. Cole took note of this and left with his men to figure out a plan of attack. Returning to Bridge 2 after lunch, he found that the engineers were still busy with repairs, so he said to hell with it, and had his men construct a makeshift footbridge so they could cross. By around 4 that arvo, after the 400-man battalion had crossed Bridge 3, the Germans opened up on them, inflicting heavy casualties. The Americans took cover as well as they could along the highway, and night set in. With darkness came the German Stukas, killing a further 30 men. Now, over 2/3 of the unit has been knocked out of the fight. Things weren't looking so hot for Cole. After the Stukas left, enemy fire subsided, and Cole had his remaining troops advance on the farmhouse, outside of which his forward units were gunned down. With that, the Germans opened fire. Losing men fast, Cole deployed a smoke screen at around 6 AM and told the 3rd Battalion's remnants to fix bayonets and get ready to charge headfirst into the fray. Upon the sound of a whistle, Cole spearheaded a reckless assault upon the farmhouse, picking up a dead comrade's rifle and bayonets on the way. First, just 20 men followed suit, then 50 more joined in. Then the whole battalion shrugged and followed their commander into the oncoming German bullets. Those who weren't mowed down engaged the enemy in close quarters combat inside and around the farmhouse, sheathing their bayonets in enemy flesh and caving in skulls as grenades burst all around them. We'll let Cole's Medal of Honor citation say what came of Cole's charge. With utter disregard for his own safety and completely ignoring the enemy fire, Cole rose to his feet in front of his battalion and shouted to his men to follow him in the assault. He led the remnants of his battalion across the bullet-swept open ground and into the enemy position. His heroic and valiant action in so inspiring his men resulted in the complete establishment of our bridgehead across the Douve River. Simply put, without Cole and his brass balls, the 101st might never have seized Carentan. Unfortunately, this American war hero was shot dead by a sniper during Operation Market Garden just a few months later and never got to hold his medal. Back in 1941, some pretty hectic stuff went down in Crete. On the 20th of May, thousands of German paratroopers descended on the Greek island, and many of them got torn apart by Australian, New Zealand and British forces fighting in league with Greek troops and pissed off Greek civilians, brandishing clubs and knives. The attacking Germans and Italians were able to regather themselves the next day, however, and over the next 13 days, they drove the Allies toward the island's south coast, massacring civilians along the way. After about a week of fighting, a contingent of Australian and New Zealand troops had been driven back to the city of Hanya. These were the Australian 27th and 28th Battalions, and the New Zealand 21st, 28th, 19th, 22nd and 23rd Battalions, with the 28th being the famed Maori Battalion. Whittled down to about half of their starting strength, the Aussie and Kiwi battalions had been tasked with rear-guarding other allied units, while said units fled to evac points along the beaches at Sfakia, bound for the relative safety of Egypt. By the 27th, the battalions had set up a defensive line in the midst of an olive grove between Sura Bay and the Malaksa escarpment along what was called 42nd Street. This is where they would make their stand against the approaching 400-man 1st Battalion of the German 141st Gebirgsjäger Regiment. According to Kiwi war records, this is how it went down. The forward companies of 21 Battalion had scarcely lined the sunken road when they heard yells that could only come from Maori throats. It was a blood-stirring haka. The Australians produced a scream even more spine-chilling than the Maori effort, and the sight of the Maori battalion charging with the vocal accompaniment sent the whole line surging forward. The forward elements of the enemy did not wait. They threw away their packs and ran. They were shot from the hip, and those who hid in the scrub were bayoneted. Little mercy was shown that day, with the joint Commonwealth force taking just 3 German prisoners. A further 280 Germans were slain, amounting to about 70% of their starting strength. On the Commonwealth side, they took a total of 52 casualties. We're going back in time for some reason, but nothing can be done about that. In September 1939, Hitler shocked the world by steamrolling into Poland. But steamrolling is a bit of an exaggeration. It wasn't a walk in the park for the Germans, especially in the Battle of Jaworów. This was part of a larger Polish offensive, one with the aim of breaking through the German line of defense and entering the Polish city of Lwów. Poles from the 11th Carpathian Infantry Division, 24th Infantry Division, and 38th Infantry Division participated in this operation under the overall command of General Kazimierz Sosnkowski. On the night of the 14th, Sosnkowski ordered his men to unload their guns and fix bayonets. Throughout the forest and villages of the Jaworów area, Germans from the SS-Standarte Germania regiments, the 7th and 57th Infantry Divisions, and the 1st and 2nd Mountain Divisions were sleeping in preparation for another big day of war. Many of them would never wake up. Poles from the 3rd Battalion of the 48th Borderlands Regiment, commanded by Colonel Jerzy Głowacki, crept toward a German position near the town of Rogozno, and then, in the wake of a grenade volley, charged the Germans with bayonets, skewering German bellies and smashing their skulls. This marked the start of a massive Polish night assault. The first of 2 that would take place on that night and also the following night, across a total of 11 Polish villages and towns. All in all, the sneaky Polish night operations resulted in the obliteration of one of SS Germania's 3 battalions, and in an attack made by Colonel Charles Hodala's 49th Hussar Rifle Regiment on the night of the 15th alone, the capture of 24 artillery pieces, 15 anti-tank guns, 20 armoured vehicles, 50 trucks and cars, and 70 motorcycles, along with a number of mortars. This was a massive win for the Poles, but not a war changer. Despite Sokonovsky's success in the Jaworów area, he could not continue on to Lwów because the USSR invaded Poland on the 17th, one day after the Battle of Jaworów came to an end. If he were to march on Lwów, his forces would have been sandwiched between the Germans and Soviets, and, like that SS Germania battalion, destroyed. In October 1944, the US 36th Division was driving the Germans through France into the Vosges Mountains when 275 men from the 1st Battalion of the Texas National Guard's 141st Regiment marched into the hills of Bifontaine, completely unaware they were being engulfed by the German front line. According to Lieutenant Erwin Blonder, the Germans knew we were coming. They had us cut right off. It was cold, wet, foggy, and we had no food and very little water. We were in a heavy forest and the artillery shells exploding near the trees would create deadly shrapnel, so we had to dig in way deep and just hang on. No rations, no water, no communications. Staff Sergeant Jack Wilson was also struck on that hill. He later recalled, "When we realized we were cut off, we cut down small trees to cover up our holes and then piled as much dirt on top as we could. We were real low on supplies, so we pulled all of our food." The following day, 2 other 141st Regiment battalions attempted to break through the German line and extricate the 1st Battalion, to no avail. A Texan breakout attempt later that day also failed, with 31 men perishing or getting captured in the process. Back at the American front line, the men started calling the Texan battalion the Lost Battalion because it did indeed seem that these men were beyond all hope. This was when the 36th Division's commander, Major General John Dahlquist, recalled the nearby Nice 442nd Infantry Regiment from rest. If anyone could save the Lost Battalion, it was these battle-worn, battle-hardened Japanese Americans. Late on the 27th, they set forth through the dense, misty forest near Bifontaine, climbing up hills and crossing ravines, dodging German landmines and lead. Sergeant Matsuji Matt Sakamoto described it like this. "It was pitch black when we started out. Each man had to hold on to the backpack of the man in front because you couldn't see him even though he was walking just in front of you. And it was drizzling and the mud was ankle deep. The mud was so sticky, it was hard to take steps. Worse yet, it was so very cold. Our fingers were so numb, they were sore." In the meantime, the Americans tried to resupply the Lost Battalion by air, firing 105mm shells filled with chocolate bars at them and dropping food-filled fuel tanks from P-47 fighter planes. Much of this food found its way into German hands, and the Germans, who were also having an absolutely terrible time in the Vosges, were grateful for it. Throughout the 28th, the Japanese Americans advanced under heavy mortar and artillery fire, taking casualty after casualty. By the end of the day, they'd come within 1,370 meters or 1,500 yards of the Lost Battalion. But Dahlquist wasn't happy. Why hadn't they rescued the Texans yet? The following morning, the 442nd closed on what was now being referred to as Suicide Hill, pushed into the fray by Dahlquist. "Don't let them stop," he said to the 100th Battalion Commander Lieutenant Colonel Gordon Singles. "There's a battalion about to die up there, and we've got to reach them." By 9:45, at which point the Nisais still hadn't rescued the Texans, Dahlquist rocked up on the battlefield and started demanding more blood from the 442nd's commanders, and blood was what they gave him. With no small amount of irony, one of the soldiers of the 442nd, it's unclear who, fixed his bayonet and began a Banzai charge on the hill, screaming "die" in English and Japanese, just like the Imperial Japanese were doing in the Pacific. According to Lieutenant Sakai Takanashi, that's what happens. They see one guy charging, then you have 5 or 6 guys going, and others join with them. Sergeant Joe Shimamura witnessed Lieutenant Colonel Alfred Purcell of the 3rd Battalion firing his .45 and rushing like a madman up the hill. "There he was up front," said Shimamura. "I guess he's going to die with the rest of us." Subsequent Banzai charges occurred throughout the rest of the day, tapering at around 3:45 that afternoon, at which point Japanese and German corpses were lying all around. According to veteran James Matsumoto, there were so many dead people on the road that they had to bring a bulldozer to push them off. We lost a lot of men there. And still, the lost battalion remains so. It was only the next day that the 442nd finally broke through, extricating the remaining 211 Texans from their German-made noose. The first man to make it through to the Texans was the aforementioned Nisei soldier Mat Sakamoto. A lost battalion sergeant named Edward Guy described the moment like this. This short, dark-skinned kid came up the hill wearing an American helmet several sizes too big and calmly asked, "Do you guys need any cigarettes?" Seeing Japanese soldiers charging them with fixed bayonets must have been a real trip for the Germans. Of course, what went down in the Vosges Mountains on that frigid October day wasn't a real Banzai charge. The 442nd weren't fanatically bum-rushing their enemy in an attempt to commit honourable suicide, which is what Banzai charges were actually about. As far as we're aware, no Banzai charges from the Second World War turned the tide of any major battles, but we're going to discuss one of these suicidal attacks anyway, notably one that went down in Saipan in July 1944. By mid-1944, the war wasn't looking so good for Imperial Japan. The Allies had issued the Japanese defeats all throughout the Pacific, and now they looked to the Mariana Islands. On the island of Saipan alone, some 32,000 troops of Lieutenant General Yoshitsugu Saito's 31st Army would fight to the bitter end against Lieutenant General Holland Smith's 5 Amphibious Corps. With the US invasion fleet departing for Saipan on the 5th of June, some called this operation the D-Day of the Pacific. The battle began on the 13th of June with a naval bombardment of the island. The first landings took place on the morning of the 15th, by means of over 300 amphibious vehicles. Japanese artillery pieces blasted at least 20 US landing vehicles out of the fight, and while Japanese machine guns, barbed wire, and trenches may have slowed the American advance, they couldn't stop it. Marines of the 2nd and 4th Divisions punched through, securing a beachhead by the end of the day. The following day, soldiers of the US 27th Infantry Division landed and advanced on a vital Japanese-held airfield in southern Saipan. By the 18th, it was in American hands, and with no reinforcements on their way, Saipan could see pretty clearly that he was fighting a losing battle. He withdrew his men to central Saipan on and around Mount Tapuchau. Here, the Americans would suffer heavy casualties trying to clear the Japanese from the caves honeycombing the island. To do this, they used satchel charges, grenades, flamethrowers, and tanks, as corroborated by Private Robert Graff of the 23rd Marines. A satchel charge would be heaved into the mouth of the cave, followed by a loud blast as the dynamite exploded. Other times, it might be grenades thrown inside the cave, both the fragment type, which sent bits of metal all throughout the cave, and other times, white phosphorus grenades. Also, the flamethrower was used, sending a sheet of flame into the cave, burning anyone in its path. Screams could be heard, and on occasions, the enemy would emerge, and our tanks would get in real close and pump shells into the opening. By the 6th of July, Saito realized the Americans were slowly but surely whittling his army down. They were going to die, and to Saito, it was better that they did so on their own terms, going head-to-head with the Americans in one last Banzai charge. It began at dawn the following morning, first with just 500 men, mostly officers, setting out from Saito's headquarters, then with thousands more falling in along the way, drunk on sake if they could get their hands on it. These weren't just Japanese soldiers, but sailors and civilians too. Wounded men limped into battle. If they didn't have a rifle and bayonets, they fastened knives to sticks or fought with their bare hands. As detailed in Captain John C. Chapin's Breaching the Marianas, the Battle for Saipan, one unnamed American rifleman recalled the Japanese attack. Suddenly, a horde of madmen broke out of the darkness. Screams of Banzai filled the air, Japanese officers leading the devils from hell, their swords swishing in circles over their heads. Our weapons opened up. Belt after belt of ammunition went through our machine gun. the gunners swinging the barrel left and right. Even though Jap bodies built up in front of us, they still charged us, running over their comrades' fallen bodies. It went on like this for 15 hours, and while the Japanese managed to inflict hundreds of casualties on the 5 amphibious corps, virtually all of the 4,300 Japanese who participated in the charge were killed. In fact, of the 32,000 Japanese on Saipan before the US invasion, at least 29,000 were killed in action or took their own lives. As for Saito, he cut out his own guts in a cave a few days after the Banzai charge. So, of the 5 infantry charges we covered, had you heard of any before today? Do you know anything about them that we didn't cover in this video? Which do you think was the most pivotal? Do you know of any other infantry charges from the Second World War that we didn't cover? Let us know all this and more in the comments section below. And as always guys, thank you so much for watching, and I hope you learned something new.